The question for today is, will Model 3 bankrupt Daimler, VW, and BMW? The second thing we cover today is kind of an update of where we are on Tesla's stock price and what we see happening in the near term. And finally, we have our usual health tips. This is Greg for Tesla Fan Insight. Thanks once again for joining us. First time on our channel, please take time to like and subscribe. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. Now, we were on our way to one show and then ended up in this one, and something really interesting popped up, which is there's a strategy that the folks at General Motors came up with, General Motors and other US manufacturers. And this, I believe, was back in the 40s or the 50s. And the strategy was that they would build a car, and then once the car was out and doing well, in the following model year, the goal would be to increase the profits from that vehicle. So they would enter a process where, for example, you cut all the screws in half. What can you remove from the car that allows it to look like a car that was popular, but you now have a new car that's more profitable? And the result was that you ended up with all these cars that ended up with a large number of defects. And as these defects were found, they typically were being fixed by dealers. So in theory, the car might last 2 or 3 years before all the defects that were sort of built in would be found out. And now you have a situation at the 3-year mark where it's now coming off lease, or customers get sick and tired of going to the dealership on these repairs, and they start the process all over again with a brand new vehicle from General Motors. So what happened to this process was that all of a sudden the Japanese arrived, particularly Toyota. And so as the Toyota vehicles in particular and other Japanese spread throughout the United States at the low end, there are a whole bunch of dealerships that were angry because all the repair work that they used to have was gone. So as a result, what ended up happening is that the US manufacturers quickly lost 50% of their market share to non-US companies, in particular Japanese manufacturers. And I have to admit, I was a little bit involved in this because I was living in Indiana in the Midwest, and I was stunned to see it seemed like it'd be un-American to not buy an American car for a long time in the Midwest. And then I went to California to college and found out that, oh, these other companies are making great cars. And the result was that I could really understand why consumers had made the transition from US manufacturers to others. So one of the reasons was the reliability and other performance aspect of the Japanese, but you also had the benefits of performance, et cetera, that you got from particularly the German manufacturers, BMW, all three of the majors, but BMW and Daimler in particular. So let's fast forward that to what's going on right now and why. And what we come up with is the fact that there's some interesting phenomenon that's happened in automobiles, let's say over the last 10 years. And what that is that a problem has emerged that Tesla identified when it started. And that is that today, if you want to build a brand new car or car manufacturing company, you can go into Google, order up about 75 to 80% of what goes into a car, have it shipped to your plant, and you have a brand new car company. So because of how easy it is for manufacturers around the world, especially people like the folks from Korea who are taking a lot of market share, because of how this whole process works, it's been very difficult for the major names to find a way to differentiate themselves. So you can go 16 valves, put a bunch of valves in the engine, get up to 500 or even 800 horsepower. There are different ways that people are trying to use to differentiate themselves. And so one of the problems that's popped up is in the hunt for differentiation, there's been a whole bunch of new technologies that's been introduced, and this new technology ends up being expensive, particularly when it's early in the process, A, and B, it ends up being the source of mega repair issues for consumers. So I bring this up because it turns out that there are a large number of consumers who, for example, right now I have a couple of friends who have a Mercedes that need $3,500 repairs, and the vehicle is maybe 7, 8 years old. The problem is that once you do 2 or 3 $7,500 or $3,500 repairs on a vehicle that's worth $3,000 to $4,000, the numbers don't work anymore. So for that reason, many people, as soon as the lease ends, have to go into a new car lease because they can't afford what it would cost to repair those vehicles. Now, that's the case, particularly when I think of BMW, VW, as well as Mercedes. But in the case of Toyota, Honda, these folks, people are getting, 150 to 200,000 miles before there are major repairs there. And so this is one of the reasons why Toyota has been able to retain market share while other companies have been losing share as this cycle has been going on. So what does all this story have to do with Tesla? Well, think about where we are now. Tesla, in theory, in the engine bay, has 17 moving parts. So once they work out the production issues of the exterior of the car, be it the body panels, gaps, and things like that, we're ending up in a position where you can get between 200,000 and 500,000 miles on your car with minimal repairs based on there just not being a lot of engine to repair. So I believe that this is a disaster for all the major makes because, as we all know, ICE engines have 2,000 parts in them, and those 2,000 parts can get very expensive to repair. So what this means then is that it's been a great situation for Germany and the German companies that are based there to not have to worry about the onslaught of cars that can both perform as well as the German vehicles do and have the potential for the maintenance process that we see when it comes to Japanese vehicles. So the problem with Tesla is Tesla represents the bring together of both of these phenomenons. It outperforms most of the vehicles in the world of every make from every metric that you could think of, number one. Number two, it has a low number of parts. So once the folks at Tesla stabilize their process, they don't have crazy things like protruding door handle of the Model S or some of the craziness of the Model X. The Model 3 represents a potential killer to the German automobile industry. So the argument we were making for this was that, is this a situation where the folks in Germany are taking the GM recipe for bankruptcy and taking it to the next level? So what's really interesting here is think about the comments that I've shared with you. What's actually happened is that the technology advances that the European makes are using to try to differentiate the performance of their cars are a great idea, but those very advances are the things that are making the cars unreliable and making it a nightmare for owners to retain those vehicles long term. So just a sidebar note here, I had a good friend of mine who had purchased a 7 Series, and this is probably 7, 8 years ago, beautiful car. And I asked her how she liked it, and she's like, Greg, it's a great car, it's beautiful, it has the space we need and everything, but the problem is that it's in the shop every other week, so we barely get to drive it. So the whole owner experience is horrible. So I bring this up because you have all these manufacturers in a pickle. If they do something that's simple, that's elegant, that works, they have a ton of competitors that do the same thing, and they can't differentiate themselves and make money on the product or protect their market share. If they do something that's very complex, you now have all these repair issues that are introduced by that complexity. So that's a disaster as well. So the large companies are kind of in a tight pickle to how to manage these two counterweighing forces, because at the end of the day, the consumers are not happy with the experiences I just described, but the companies are stuck in a position where, for example, if the car has to be replaced at 3 years and you're not going to stay in it, it's a great news for the company because you have to lease a new vehicle, great news for the dealerships because you'll be back in, great news for all the people that are fixed because all that stuff has to be fixed. Well, guess what? When you switch to electric in a Model 3 with 1 or 2 motors in there, all of a sudden you have all kinds of simplicity that systematically eliminates a large number of suppliers, as well as it just basically creates chaos in the system because of the number of suppliers and manufacturers that are no longer viable. So this is an interesting cake that we've baked, and this brings up the question of why it is that the Model 3 could bankrupt a number of companies. And the answer is that, for example, Elon Musk has made a few mistakes in his management moves. For example, buying Solar City cost the company several $1 billion. The door handles of the Model 3 look great, but on the other hand, it's the number one repair item that they have to deal with. So there's been these slowdown elements to Tesla's success that Elon has introduced. You could play a scenario where if in fact Tesla decided to stop production of cars today and only produce the semi-truck, you have unlimited, like millions of potential orders by different companies for that truck right now. So it's a good thing for Daimler and others that Elon Musk is sort of unfocused in some cases on what he's doing, because if he became focused and organized, it'd be a colossal disaster. Now, it'd be a colossal disaster for obvious reasons. Number one, you have a great performing car that doesn't have a lot of moving parts that last for a long time. All of those are a huge problem because if you have large number of customers getting into Model 3s and they're having a good experience, they're going to keep those cars for a long time and get rid of their ICE vehicles and happily sort of transition the process into electric a lot faster. So that's kind of what Elon Musk is eyeing as they're moving down in price points on vehicles. Clearly, they're not at the $35K vehicle yet, but the goal is to move into those lower price points because it expands the number of consumers that can afford to make the transition to electric. So my goal of this talk was really just to introduce the process as to how and why places like BMW, VW, et cetera, could go bankrupt. And what's interesting, another sort of interesting element of this whole thing is that, these are huge companies with huge amount of resources to deal with competitors, and Tesla has still had no problem dealing with them. So one of the strategies that you could use, and that's been going on for the last few years, is that if Tesla is a relatively niche player with small number of vehicles sold, it's easy to maybe lose a few sales, but it's not a big deal. Now that we're entering the prospect of 250,000 cars from China starting the middle of this year, along with the call it 500,000 cars that'll come from the Fremont factory shipped globally, you now have a very interesting situation emerging where the number of cars from Tesla now and sort of into the future isn't going to be overwhelming. Overwhelming means, they're going to be 3 to 5% of the auto business. But the challenge is that if they're cherry picking some of the best pieces of the business and now they disappear, you have companies that are built stair to step on manufacturing operations that need a certain amount of throughput in order to stay viable and profitable. And as Tesla's count of cars rises, you will start to see initially diminishing profitability for these companies, and then eventually losses, and this is when we get into the whole discussion of bankruptcy. So I believe that, the recipe for bankruptcy is develop cars that consumers are scared to buy because they fall apart real fast, and all of a sudden they start going towards Japanese or other manufacturers. The final part of the recipe that I see emerging that really causes me to question if everyone is really headed towards the bankruptcy train is the whole battery solution that LG has created that's been adopted by most of the auto industry. It's either a terrific battery that's going to wipe Tesla out or make Tesla's life more miserable, or it's a great battery technology that has a major flaw. And in my mind, the major flaw that I'm seeing is what I call Plan B. So if you drive a vehicle and your batteries, the temperatures are perfect, everything is wonderful, and you can rely on that vehicle to perform as expected. What happens when you need Plan B? So what I mean by this is that Tesla's systems are set up to, in essence, if it's too cold, the batteries can use the heating system to heat up a fluid, and that fluid allows them to control the cell temperatures so the cells can operate at an efficient temperature. If it's too hot, same thing. So if everything's perfect, there doesn't have to be the use of the cell management process, if you will, to manage how the cells are performing. Where I see a problem popping up and why I think bankruptcy is real is I see Tesla ramping up production rapidly in every sector, including trucks. And I see the solutions that are coming out from the manufacturers like Daimler and others, and they're all lining up with the LG batteries, and I don't see a thermal management system there. So if, in fact, you have either very cold or very hot circumstances that you put those pouch or prismatic batteries into, and you have difficult operating environments of a car running, vehicles are pretty hot themselves, so they can run, at speed, whether it's very hot or very cold. It doesn't seem to me that it's been an emphasis point of the Korean manufacturers to figure out what I call the regular operating conundrum of this. But there's also the issue of the supercharging conundrum, which is when you force electricity at high speeds into these batteries, or it's expended at high speed, for example, in ludicrous mode, you end up with a situation where there's a lot of heat generated there. And if that heat isn't managed properly, you could damage the batteries. So nobody knows yet how this is going to all work out. And it could be perfect, and therefore I'm wrong. But the issue, though, is how can you deliver something that doesn't have a built-in Plan B where consumers can be confident that thing is going to work out well, short and long term, in terms of making sure there's a healthy battery set that can get both consumer and car into the future a decent distance with other manufacturers. So stay tuned. We're going to find out how this all plays out. It's my belief that, I guess the answer is probably in the middle. They're going to be slow to market anyway because they don't have volumes of batteries that they need to be competitive right away. Number one. Number two, all of the companies are all using the same solutions. So how do you differentiate yourself when 50% of the cars are the same across all the manufacturers? Some really interesting questions there about how different layered. I believe that it's possible that some of the biggest companies in the world are following the GM recipe into bankruptcy, and I think that's unfortunate. I hope the LG product works because you need viable electric solutions across a large number of vehicles because Tesla can't produce everything that is out there in terms of need. But we'll all be finding out how this all works out. And we'll look forward to cover it and keeping you abreast of the situation. At any rate, want to thank you for joining us. As usual, just a reminder, don't go to bed within 2 hours of eating, preferably 4 hours, to make sure you don't get acid indigestion. Number two, 20 leg lifts a day, both legs. I'm about to go do mine myself, and I think you'll find it helpful in terms of strengthening your legs, reducing the chance of knee replacements, et cetera, needing to be done. Reminder, we could use your like, subscription, and comments. And we look forward to our next show. We have a show we're developing on the Tesla semi-truck that I think you guys will find interesting. Any rate, thanks once again for joining us, and any comments or suggestions for improvement, we're open to and look forward to from you. Have a great day, and we'll look forward to our next conversation.